The stagecoach hit a rut so deep that Annie Harper's hat flew clean off her head and landed in the lap of the stranger sitting across from her, which was how she learned that the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1889 did not ease anyone gently into its embrace. She snatched the hat back with a murmured apology and pressed it down firmly over her dark auburn hair, then turned to look out the window at the landscape rolling past. It was nothing like Ohio. It was nothing like anything she had ever seen. The land stretched in every direction with a kind of brutal confidence, vast and golden and indifferent, broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwood trees shivering along a creek bed, or the dark shape of a hawk riding a thermal high above the blue-stem grass. She had read about it in pamphlets. She had studied maps. She had told herself, quite firmly, sitting in her sister's parlor back in Columbus while her sister cried and begged her not to go, that she was ready for hardship. That she was built for it. That she had survived enough already to prove as much. But the pamphlets had not mentioned the heat. It was only April, and already the sun had baked the red clay earth into something resembling the surface of a furnace. The pamphlets had also not mentioned the smell, a rich and complicated mixture of dust and horse and dried grass, and something underneath it all that she could only describe as the smell of wide-open consequence, as though every decision made out here would be permanent. Annie Harper was 26 years old. She was a widow, though the word still sat wrong on her tongue like a coin she was not sure how to spend. Her husband, George Harper, had died of a lung infection the previous November, leaving her with a small amount of debt, a house that belonged to his family and not to her, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from loving someone deeply but from standing at a grave and realizing that you had been lonely for years before they died. She did not say this to anyone. She felt the meanness of it, but it was true. The land rush had been announced that winter. April 22nd, 1889, the unassigned lands in Indian Territory would be opened for settlement, and anyone who could stake a claim and hold it would own 160 acres of American possibility. Annie had read the announcement in the newspaper and felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement exactly, more like recognition, like the sound of a door opening in a house she had never been inside before. She had spent the month since then preparing. She learned what she could about farming, about soil composition, about building with sod. She bought what she could afford, a good trunk full of seeds, some tools, bolts of sturdy fabric, a rifle she had practiced with until she could shoot it straight. She sold her wedding ring, not out of spite but out of practicality, and used the money to pay for her passage and a month's worth of supplies. And then she had climbed aboard a train and then a stagecoach, and now here she was, jolting across a landscape that seemed to have no edges, headed for a town called Guthrie, where she planned to register her claim and begin the absolute and deliberate construction of her own life. The stagecoach rolled into Guthrie on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, and Annie stepped down onto a street that could barely be called a street. It was a wide scar of red earth lined on both sides by a chaos of tents and half-built wooden structures, and people moving in every direction at once, shouting, hauling lumber, arguing over property lines, driving wagons into each other, and then arguing about that too. A canvas banner had been strung between two poles over what appeared to be a land office. It read Guthrie Townsite, and below it someone had added in rough letters that were clearly the work of a different hand entirely, "God help us all." Annie picked up her trunk and started walking. The land office was crowded with men, a solid wall of shoulders and hats and competing voices, all of them pressing toward a single table behind which two exhausted-looking clerks were trying to process claims. Annie set her trunk down outside and stepped into the back of the line. She was, she observed, the only woman in it. Several men turned to look at her. She looked back at each of them steadily until they turned away. She waited for 2 hours. When she finally reached the table, the clerk looked up at her with the blank expression of a man who had already processed 60 people that day and had no interest in being surprised by anything. "Name," he said. Annie Harper. He wrote it down without comment. Proof of citizenship. She produced her documents. He examined them, stamped something, wrote something else. Section 42, he said, sliding a paper across the table. Northeast quarter. Creek runs along the south edge. You've got a neighbor filed this morning on the southeast quarter, fellow named Rhodes. He paused and looked at her with slightly more focus than before. That's good land, Miss Harper. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and don't let anyone push you off it. She took the paper and folded it carefully and put it inside her coat. I won't, she said. The neighbor named Rhodes turned out to be the first person Annie encountered when she drove her rented wagon out to her claim the following morning, though encountered might be too gentle a word for it. She was attempting to read the survey stakes while also managing a horse that had developed opinions about the creek at the south edge of her property, and the horse's opinions were resulting in the wagon veering steadily toward the water when a man on a gray horse appeared from the direction of the southeast quarter and said, loud and easy, "Pull left and give her her head for a second. She wants a drink, not a swim." Annie pulled left. The horse walked calmly to the edge of the creek, dropped her nose into the water and drank deeply. The wagon settled. She looked at the man who had offered the advice. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled by someone who took their work seriously. Strong jaw, straight nose, dark eyes that caught the morning light with a quality she could not immediately name. He was wearing a battered brown hat and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he was looking at her the way people sometimes look at a complicated piece of machinery, with interest and some respect. Micah Rhodes, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Southeast quarter. Annie Harper, she said, northeast quarter. I know, he gestured at the survey stakes. You're reading those right incidentally. A lot of people get turned around out here because east feels like north in flat country. You've got your bearings. She did not know why that small piece of acknowledgement settled something in her, but it did. Thank you for the tip about the horse, she said. Her name is Clover, he said. At least that's what the stable man told you. It's written on her stall card. She's willful but honest, which is about the best you can hope for from a horse. Annie looked at Clover, who was still drinking with serene indifference. And from people, she said. Micah Rhodes smiled. It was a slow smile, not a wide one, the kind that arrived incrementally as though checking itself at every stage. That's true, he said. You need help getting that wagon situated. I've been out here since yesterday and I've got a rough sense of the drainage. She wanted to say no. She had come here to do things herself, and the pride in that was real and earned, and she did not intend to start trading it away on the first morning. But the land was genuinely confusing and she genuinely did not know where to start, and Micah Rhodes did not have the air of a man offering help as a form of condescension. He had the air of a neighbor. I would appreciate that, she said. Yes. They spent the morning walking her claim together. He showed her where the drainage ran after rain, where the soil was deepest, where a small rise to the north would block the worst of the winter wind if she built her shelter there. He did not tell her what to do exactly. He explained what he had observed and left the conclusions to her. She found this arrangement not only tolerable but actively pleasant. Where are you from? She asked at one point when they were standing on the low rise looking south toward the creek. Texas originally, he said. Spent some years in Kansas after that. Wichita, then a stretch on a cattle drive up to Abilene. You? Ohio, she said. He nodded as if Ohio were a completely reasonable place to have come from, which she appreciated. Why here? He asked. Because it was possible, she said. Because the land is open and the law says I can claim it same as anyone. She paused. And because I needed something that was mine. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I understand that. Something in the way he said it told her that he did, not as a courtesy but as a fact. She did not ask more, not that first morning, but she filed it away. They parted at noon and she began the work that would consume the next several months of her life. She had read about sod building, but reading about it and actually cutting sod were activities so entirely unlike each other that they might as well have been written in different languages. The sod was heavy. It was alive with roots and insects, and a kind of resistance that felt almost personal. Each brick of it had to be cut and lifted and stacked. And by the end of the first day, Annie's hands were bleeding through her gloves and her back was a single long cord of pain, and she had built approximately 4 feet of wall. She sat outside in the early evening and ate cold beans from the tin she had packed and looked at her 4 feet of wall and thought, "Good, that is 4 feet more than I had this morning." Micah Rhodes appeared at the edge of her property just before dark, walking this time rather than riding, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He stopped at a polite distance. "I made too much cornbread," he said. "If you want some." She was going to say she was fine. She said, "Yes, thank you," instead, because the beans were cold and the cornbread was warm and she was a practical woman. He sat down on a stone a few feet from her, and they ate in the kind of quiet that is not awkward but simply shared. The sky went from orange to deep rose to a blue so saturated it was almost purple, and the first stars appeared with a clarity that took her breath away. Ohio had stars, technically, but Ohio also had trees and buildings and the accumulated light of civilization obscuring them. Out here the stars were emphatic. "Do you have any experience with sod construction?" she asked. "Some," he said. "Enough. The key is the corner joints. Most first-time builders get the corners wrong and the whole thing settles funny after the first hard rain." "Show me tomorrow," she said. "Sure," he said. Simple as that. That was how it began between them, not with any declaration or dramatic moment, but with the simple daily grammar of people who live close to each other and find the proximity natural. He would appear in the morning sometimes with a practical observation or a question about what she was planning, and she would sometimes walk south along the creek to look at how his soddy was progressing, and they would talk. The talking was easy. It surprised her how easy it was. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn the topography of new country, one contour at a time. He was 31 years old. He had spent his 20s working cattle, which was honest labor and paid reasonably, but required you to be someone else's man, following someone else's herd, and he had wanted to stop being that. He had a younger brother in Texas named Eli, who he spoke of with obvious affection and a little worry. His mother had died when he was 15, and his father was still alive down in San Antonio, a man he described as difficult but not unkind. He had never been married. When she told him she had been and that George had died, he said, "I'm sorry," with the exact right weight on it, not too much and not too little. "Thank you," she said. "It was complicated." "Most things are," he said. He wasn't a bad man, she said, not sure why she felt the need to explain but feeling it nonetheless. "We just didn't fit. We were young and I thought I was supposed to, and then I was, and then he was gone and I was standing in a house that wasn't mine, feeling like I'd been living someone else's life." Micah was quiet for a moment. "And now you're living yours," he said. "Trying to," she said. "Looks like more than trying from where I'm sitting," he said. She did not look at him when he said that because she was afraid of what her face would do. But she felt it somewhere low and certain in her chest, a warmth she had not felt in a long time and was not entirely sure what to do with. By June her soddy was finished, 4 solid walls and a roof, and a small window she had framed carefully with the lumber she had hauled from Guthrie. It was dark and low-ceilinged, and had a certain earthen quality that she suspected would persist no matter how much she swept, but it was hers. Every inch of it was hers. She stood in the doorway on the morning it was finished and let herself feel the fullness of that for a long moment. She had planted her kitchen garden along the south wall where the light was best, and her field crops on the lower ground near the creek where the soil was richest. She had corn and sorghum and a small patch of wheat, and she had learned quickly that farming was not one thing but 100 things done simultaneously and all of them urgent. There was always something that needed immediate attention, the garden needing water, a fence section needing repair, a tool needing sharpening. The days were full in a way that was hard and also deeply satisfying. Guthrie itself was growing at a speed that seemed almost fantastical. In the weeks after the land rush, a real town had materialized out of the chaos of tents, wooden storefronts, a hardware store, a general store run by a man named Beaumont who charged too much for everything but was the only option, a post office, a church that was also briefly a schoolhouse, and at the north end of the main street, a saloon called the Territorial that served watered-down whiskey and accurate gossip in roughly equal measure. Annie rode into town every couple of weeks to resupply and post letters to her sister in Ohio, who wrote back with escalating degrees of alarm. "You cannot possibly be happy out there," her sister wrote in June. "There are no theaters and no society, and the climate sounds dreadful." Annie wrote back that she was in fact quite well, that the climate was dramatic rather than dreadful, and that she had not missed the theater once. She did not mention Micah Rhodes in her letters, though she thought about mentioning him often. She was not yet sure what there was to say. What she could have said, if she had been willing to put it in writing, was this: that she had begun to look for him without meaning to, that the sound of his horse crossing the dry ground between their claims in the early morning had become something she noticed and noted, that their conversations had grown longer and ranged further from practical matters into territory she had not mapped with anyone in a long time. She could have said that when he laughed, which was not frequently but was always genuine, she felt something loosen in her that had been tight for years. She could have said that on the evening he had helped her repair her fence after a thunderstorm had knocked 3 sections flat, and they had worked in the rain together because the horses needed to be contained that night regardless of the weather, and he had said nothing at all about the rain but had simply kept working, steady and focused beside her. She had felt more accompanied than she had felt in her marriage, more known. She did not say any of this in her letters. In July, a man named Darrell Croft rode out from Guthrie and presented himself at her property line. He was heavyset with small eyes and a way of looking at her land rather than at her when he spoke. He said he was interested in purchasing her quarter section and named a price that was insulting in its smallness. "I'm not selling," Annie said. "You're a woman alone out here," Croft said, still looking at her land. "It's going to get harder before it gets easier." "Everything worth doing is hard," she said. "I'm not selling." "You'll want to reconsider," he said, and the edge in it was not quite a threat but was shaped like one. "I won't," she said. "Good day, Mr. Croft." After he left, she sat with her hands flat on her kitchen table for a few minutes, feeling the anger move through her like a weather system, and then she went back to work. She did not tell Micah about the visit that day. She told him 3 days later because she wanted to do her own thinking about it first, and she found that she had. When she told him, something changed in his expression. Not alarm exactly, but an attentiveness that sharpened. "Darrell Croft," he said. "I've heard the name in town. He's been trying to assemble parcels along the creek drainage. He wants the water rights." "I know," she said. "I figured that out. He came to see me last week," Micah said. "I sent him off too." There was a particular relief in hearing that, though she was not sure which part of it relieved her more. The knowledge that she was not being singled out, or the knowledge that Micah had said no. "If he comes back and gives you any real trouble," Micah said, "you tell me." "I can handle trouble," she said. "I know you can," he said, and again there was nothing patronizing in it. "But there's a difference between handling something alone and having someone beside you when you do it. You don't have to choose the harder version just to prove you can." She looked at him for a long moment. The July sun was falling golden and late across his face, and he was looking at her with that steady dark-eyed attention that she had come to understand as a fundamental quality of him, the way he looked at everything, fully, without flinching, without rushing. "That's a very reasonable thing to say," she said. "I'm a reasonable man," he said. "You are," she said. "It's one of your more irritating qualities." He smiled at that, the slow-building smile, and she looked away and told herself that the warmth in her face was the sun. But that night, lying in her dark soddy listening to the coyotes make their noise somewhere out on the plains, she let herself think about him honestly, which she had been avoiding with some skill for 2 months. She let herself consider what it meant that he was the first thing she thought about when something went well, and the first person she wanted to talk to when something went wrong. She let herself notice that she had been happier in the last 3 months, doing genuinely hard and physical labor in a barely finished earthen house with no running water and no conveniences of any kind, than she had been in the 5 years of her marriage in a proper house in Columbus with a husband who was polite to her. She did not think it was merely loneliness. She thought it was him, specifically, the particular shape and texture of him, his humor and his practicality, and the way he listened, and the way he worked, and the way he had said you don't have to choose the harder version just to prove you can, which she suspected she would remember for the rest of her life. She fell asleep thinking about this and woke up the next morning with a clarity she had not had the night before. She was falling in love with her neighbor. It was inconvenient and it was real and it was, she thought, probably mutual, though she had not yet fully confirmed the last part. August arrived with a heat so relentless it seemed intentional. The creek dropped to half its normal depth. Annie's corn suffered but held. She learned to start her outdoor work at dawn and retreat inside through the worst of the midday heat, emerging again in late afternoon when the shadow of her small soddy stretched long across the garden. She read in the evenings by lamplight, and twice a week Micah would come over after supper, and they would sit outside in the cooling air and talk. They talked about everything. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, her father who had been a school teacher and had given her books and the habit of reading them seriously, her mother who had been practical in the way of a woman who had no other option, and had passed this quality along without intending to. She told him about her failed attempts at fitting into Columbus society, the sense that she was always slightly too blunt, too direct, too interested in wrong things. He told her about the cattle drives, the boredom and the beauty of them, the long flat weeks on the trail and the sudden violent storms, the camaraderie of a crew and the way it ended absolutely when the drive was done and everyone scattered. He told her about a year he had spent in Wichita working as a deputy, which he had left because he found the law as it was practiced in Kansas cow towns to be mostly a mechanism for managing violence rather than preventing it, and he had wanted more than that. He told her about the land rush, how he had ridden the starting line at noon on April 22nd and had felt, for the first time in years, that he was riding toward something rather than just through it. "Were you frightened?" she asked. "Terrified," he said. "Best kind of terrified, the kind where you're frightened because you want something badly enough for failure to matter." She understood this completely. "That's exactly how I felt on the stagecoach coming in," she said. "I kept thinking that I was either making the best decision of my life or the worst one, and the only way to find out was to arrive." "And which was it?" he asked. She looked at him across the few feet of evening air between them, at his profile against the darkening sky, at the ease of him, the solidity, the way he inhabited the space he occupied without apology or performance. "Best," she said, "by a considerable margin." He turned to look at her then, and she met his eyes, and there was a moment that lasted longer than a moment, a point of stillness in which something passed between them that had been building since that first morning at the creek when he had told her about Clover, and the horse had drunk, and the world had been manageable. She felt her heart doing something complicated and decided to let it. "Annie," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it had before, slower and more deliberate, like he was tasting the weight of it. "Yes," she said, meaning yes to whatever he was about to say, yes to the whole of it. But before he could say whatever came next, there was a sound from the south, a horse coming fast, and they both turned toward it. A rider appeared out of the dark, pulling up hard at the edge of the lamplight. It was young Tommy Beaumont, the storekeeper's son, who was maybe 16 and whose horse was breathing hard. "Mr. Rhodes," he said. "Miss Harper, there's trouble in town. Croft's men have been at the land office. Someone broke in tonight and there are papers missing. The sheriff wants everyone with a claim along the creek to come in tomorrow and verify their filings." Micah was on his feet immediately. "Anyone hurt?" "One of the clerks got roughed up," Tommy said. "He's all right, but the sheriff says to come tomorrow morning and bring your copies." Annie's hand moved to the inside pocket of her coat where she kept her claim papers. Instinctively, the way you touch a wound to check if it is real. The papers were there. They were always there. She had never gone anywhere without them since that first day at the land office. "We'll be there," Micah said. Tommy nodded and wheeled his horse back toward town. In the silence after the hoofbeats faded, Annie was already thinking practically. "He wants the water," she said. "He's trying to invalidate the claims along the creek drainage so he can refile them himself." "That's what it looks like," Micah said. He was very still in the way she had come to recognize as him thinking hard and fast. "We should go together in the morning. Present the papers at the same time. There's a better case made when both neighbors are consistent." "I agree," she said. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, he said. The moment between them had passed, or rather it had been folded and put aside for later like a letter you intend to answer when time permits. But as Micah said goodnight and walked south toward his own claim, Annie noticed that he paused once and looked back, and she was still watching, and they both knew it, and that was something. The morning at the land office was crowded and tense. The sheriff, a lean, methodical man named Calvin Prout, had set up a table outside and was going through every filing along the creek drainage individually. Croft was there with 2 men who had the particular stillness of hired muscle, and a lawyer from Kansas City who kept adjusting his cuffs and speaking in the carefully smooth tones of a man accustomed to making his arguments sound like common sense. Annie presented her papers first, then Micah presented his. Sheriff Prout examined both sets with the slow patience of a man who had been fooled before and had learned from it. He compared them against the office copies, cross-referenced the survey numbers, and finally looked up. "These are correct and complete," he said. "Filings are valid." The Kansas City lawyer began to speak. Annie looked at him steadily until he stopped, which she recognized was not her doing alone, but was helped considerably by the fact that Micah was standing directly beside her, and Micah had the kind of physical presence that made a certain type of argument feel unwise. Croft looked at Annie directly for the first time. His small eyes had the flat quality of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through persistence. "That land is going to be too much for you," he said. "You have said that before," she said. "You were wrong then. The territory gets hard in winter," he said. "I expect it does," she said. "I also expect I will still be here in spring." Prout cleared his throat and looked at Croft. "Filing is valid, Mr. Croft. These claims stand. If I hear of any further interference with legal filings or their holders, I will be responding with considerable legal force. Are we clear?" Croft left without answering, which she supposed was answer enough. The lawyer followed him with the particular efficiency of a man who had billed his hours and had no further investment in the outcome. Micah turned to Annie after they had gone and said, "You handled that well." "We handled that well," she said, and he smiled. They rode home together along the creek trail, the horses walking easy in the morning cool, and the conversation that had been interrupted the night before was there between them again, unfinished but patient. She did not rush it. Some things needed to arrive in their own time. What arrived first, as September settled in, was rain. Not the dramatic thunderstorms of summer, but a steady, persistent, gray sky rain that lasted for a week and turned the red clay into something that gripped at wagon wheels and boot heels with equal determination. The creek rose to its normal level and then above it. Annie's crops were done for the season anyway, her corn harvested and stored, her kitchen garden put to bed. But the rain meant that certain outdoor repairs were impossible and indoor time was absolute. She spent the rainy days doing the quiet work of settlement, mending, preserving, reading, writing letters, studying seed catalogs for next spring. She had a copy of a farming manual she had read twice already and was reading again, taking notes this time, planning her rotations. She was making this land better. She could feel it. not just in what she had built but in the way the soil was starting to respond to her management, the way the garden had produced more than she had expected, the way the creek bank she had stabilized with willow cuttings in June was already showing green. On the fourth day of the rain, Micah appeared at her door in the late afternoon with his hat soaked through and his boots dark with clay and a look on his face that suggested he had been going back and forth about something and had finally reached a conclusion. "Come in," she said. "There is coffee." He came in and stood just inside the doorway in that courteous way of his, not filling the space unnecessarily. She handed him the coffee and he took it with both hands the way you do when something is genuinely warming you. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said. She sat down at her small table and folded her hands and looked at him. "I've been thinking about what I was going to say 2 nights ago before Tommy came," he said. "Before Croft and all of that." "I remember," she said. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "And I'm not a man who rushes into things he hasn't thought through. But I've been thinking about this for long enough that it doesn't feel rushed anymore." "What is it?" she said, though she knew. She knew, and her heart was doing that complicated thing again, and she let it. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said. It came out simply, without any performance. "I think about you when you're not there, and I look forward to when you are, and every time I'm with you I leave feeling like the world has more in it than I knew." He paused. "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing. With your full understanding that I'm not trying to take anything from you that you've built, not your independence, not your land, not your way of doing things. I'm just saying that I would very much like to be in your life in the kind of way that matters." The rain was loud on the sod roof. The lamp was burning quietly. Annie looked at this man, this honest, steady, competent, surprising man who had appeared at the edge of her creek on her first morning and told her how to water her horse and had been beside her in every difficulty since without once making her feel diminished by it. "Micah," she said, "I have been falling in love with you since approximately the second week of May." Something moved across his face, quick and bright like sunlight on moving water. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure," she went on. "Not sure of you, I was sure of you fairly early, sure of myself. Sure that I was choosing it and not just falling into it because you were kind to me and I was lonely. I've been lonely before and I know what that feels like, and this is different. You are different. The way I feel when I'm with you is different." "Annie," he said, and again her name in his mouth had that quality of something handled carefully. "Yes," she said, "I am absolutely willing." He crossed the small room and sat down across from her, and reached across the table and took her hand. Just that. Just the warm, solid fact of his hand around hers. And they sat like that, with the rain coming down and the lamp burning and the world outside going on about its vast business. And Annie thought she had never felt so exactly where she was supposed to be. Courtship in the Oklahoma Territory in the fall of 1889 was a practical affair, conducted mostly between two people who already spent a good deal of time in each other's company, and therefore did not have to manufacture occasions. What changed was the quality of the time, a new attentiveness, a new willingness to say things directly that had previously been left in the territory of implication. He brought her things, not extravagant gifts but useful and considered ones. A particular kind of nail she had mentioned needing for the window frame, a cutting from a rosebush he had found growing wild along a fence line 3 miles east, a book of maps he had come across in the Guthrie General Store that covered the territory in detail, and which he knew she would use. She brought him things too, a jar of the apple preserves she had made with dried apples traded from a woman in town, a properly sharpened handsaw she had borrowed from Beaumont's hardware store and sharpened herself before returning to him. Evenings. The evenings were the best of it. They had always talked, but now they talked differently, with the edges softened, with longer silences that were not uncomfortable but inhabited. He told her things he had not told anyone, she thought, or not in a long time, small things and large ones alike. She did the same. They built something between them that was made of words and shared work, and the particular trust that comes from having been tested by the same hard ground and found reliable. He kissed her for the first time at the beginning of October, in the early morning when she was coming back from checking on her horses, and he was crossing from his claim with a question about a survey line, and they met at the midpoint between their properties, in the long golden light of an autumn morning with the cottonwoods along the creek just beginning to turn. The kiss was unhurried and certain, and she thought afterward that it was the most honest thing she had felt in years. "Good morning," he said when it ended. "Good morning," she said, and smiled. October and November were the months of harvest end and winterizing. Annie worked like a person who had everything to lose because she had everything to gain. She chinked her sod walls with fresh mud and grass. She built a small cold cellar to store her preserves and her root vegetables. She repaired the fence sections that had weakened and laid in as much firewood as she could manage, which was not quite enough, as she would discover in January. She purchased a proper stove from a hardware dealer who came through Guthrie in October, a small but efficient iron range that she installed with guidance from the dealer's printed instructions and the occasional practical suggestion from Micah, who had done the same installation 2 weeks earlier on his own property. The social life of Guthrie had organized itself into something resembling a real town's rhythms by fall, a church social on alternating Sundays, a small school that had acquired an actual teacher, a ladies' aid society that Annie attended twice before concluding that her time was better spent elsewhere, though she did not say this to the ladies, who were perfectly nice, merely organized around concerns she did not share. There were dances sometimes on Saturday nights, held in the largest of the early buildings, where the fiddle and the caller created a world inside 4 walls that had nothing to do with hard clay and drought and the anxiety of a first winter. Micah danced. She had not expected this. She had not expected the particular pleasure of his hand at her back during a waltz, or the way he moved, which was the way he did everything, with economy and attention and no wasted motion. She had not expected to feel in the middle of a crowded room smelling of lantern oil and autumn dust, as though there were only the 2 of them in it. "You're good at this," she told him between songs. "My mother taught me," he said. She said a man who can dance is a man who can listen with his body, and that was a necessary skill. "She sounds like she was wise," Annie said. "She was the wisest person I ever knew," he said, "until recently." She looked at him to see if he was flattering her, but his expression was plain and serious, and she took it as the fact he meant it to be. November brought the first cold, not the killing cold of the northern plains, which she had heard described in terms suggesting biblical punishment, but a real cold, a settling, emphatic cold that came down from the north overnight and turned the red earth gray with frost. Annie woke the first morning of it to find ice on the inside of her window, and Clover making her displeasure known from the small barn she had built over the summer. She built her fire and fed her horses and did the morning's work, and then stood in the doorway of her soddy looking north at the pale sky and felt, for the first time since her arrival, a thread of genuine concern. Winter was not a thing that could be solved with hard work and good preparation alone. Winter was a force you negotiated with. She had provisions enough, she thought. The firewood might be short. The cold draft along the north wall was worse than she had anticipated. Micah appeared at midday. He had ridden his property line in the morning, and he had a matter-of-fact assessment ready. The winter was going to be cold, but not catastrophic. The forecasters in the Territory Gazette had said as much, and she had enough provisions if she was careful. The firewood situation could be remedied. He had located a stand of dead timber along the creek 3 miles west, and he proposed that they spend the next 2 days hauling and splitting it together. "I could do it myself," she said. "You could," he said. "So could I, but it would take each of us twice as long and cost twice the cold, and there's no logic in that when we're right here." "You have a deeply inconvenient tendency to be right about things," she said. "I work at it," he said. They spent 2 cold days hauling and splitting wood and stacking it against her north wall, and the work was hard and good. And by the end of the second day, she had more firewood than she had started the winter with, more than she strictly needed, which meant that the anxiety that had been sitting in the back of her chest since the first frost was gone, and in its place was something quieter and more solid. "Thank you," she said that second evening genuinely. "That's what neighbors are for," he said. "You're more than a neighbor," she said. He looked at her across the stack of new-cut wood and said, "I'd like to be." "You already are," she said. "I was stating a fact, not making a complaint." He laughed, a real laugh, clear and warm in the cold air. She loved his laugh. She had thought this before, and she thought it again now without qualification or self-conscious management. December arrived, and with it a kind of social intensification. The community that had been building since April reached for its first Christmas with the particular enthusiasm of people who had survived a hard beginning and wanted to celebrate it. There was a tree cut from the cedar breaks south of town and set up in the church, and a potluck Christmas dinner to which Annie brought her apple preserves and a dried apple cake that she had made from a recipe her mother had written in the back of a cookbook. She sat at the long table beside Micah and across from a couple named Frank and Helen Dawes who had a claim to the east. And Frank said grace and someone's baby cried, and the fiddle player who had gotten there early played 3 Christmas tunes while people were still finding seats, and the room was full and warm and smelled of cedar and roasted meat and the particular contentment of people who have made something together out of nothing. Walking back to the wagon afterward, Micah took her hand without preamble, the way you reach for something you have decided belongs in your hand. She laced her fingers through his. "I want to ask you something," he said. The night was very cold and very clear. The stars were the same extravagant stars she had noticed on her first night in the territory, still just as emphatic, and she was no longer surprised by them but still grateful. "Ask," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not immediately if you need time. Not as a way of changing anything about how things are between us, because how things are between us is good and I know that, and I'm not trying to fix what isn't broken. But I love you and I want to marry you and I want to build a proper life with you here on this land. And I want you to say yes if you want to and no if you don't, and either way I'll still be here." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her and turned to look at her, and the lamplight from the church behind them reached just far enough to show her his face, open and steady and entirely without pretense. "Micah," she said. "Annie," he said. "Yes," she said, "because I want to. Not because I need to. Not because it makes practical sense, though it does. But because you are the person I want to wake up next to and argue with and eat dinner with and build things with. And I love you in a way I didn't know I was capable of before this year." He pulled her close and held her for a moment with his cheek against the top of her head and her face against the warm, solid wall of his coat, and she thought that here was the truth of it. This was what she had not known she was coming here for. This man, this particular man, this quiet strength and honest heart and steady hand. She had come for her own life, and she had found that her own life, fully and properly lived, had room for him in it, and that the room he occupied made the whole structure stronger. They married in February, which was perhaps not the most romantic month in the territory, the wind having an opinion about everything, and the mud deciding it was a participant in all outdoor activities. But the church was warm, and the minister was a man who clearly enjoyed his work, and Sheriff Prout and Frank and Helen Dawes and Tommy Beaumont's parents, and about 30 other people from town, and the surrounding claims filled the pews. Annie wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and she had embroidered the cuffs herself over the winter evenings with a white thread that caught the light. Her hair was up under her good hat, the same hat that had fallen off on the stagecoach on her first day, and she thought as she adjusted it in the small looking-glass before the ceremony that she looked well. Not like a different person than the one who had stepped off that stagecoach in April with her trunk and her certainty and her careful preparations. Like the same person, made more fully herself. Micah was waiting at the front of the church, and when she walked down the aisle, which was actually just the central space between the pew benches, and he saw her. His expression did something she wanted to remember for the rest of her life. It was not surprise. It was recognition, the look of a man seeing exactly what he had been waiting for and knowing it. The vows were the traditional words, but Annie meant every one of them in the full particular weight of their meaning: to love and to honor, to have and to hold, in hardship and in plenty, which was a more literal description of their life than most people's when they said it. She meant it. She felt it land in her like something completing a circuit. "I do," she said, looking at him. "I do," he said, looking at her. After the ceremony there was more food and fiddle music, and a great deal of congratulating, and the kind of genuine community joy that happens when people who have been through hard things together celebrate a good one. Helen Dawes cried, and said that she had known from the first time she had seen them together in October that this would happen. Tommy Beaumont, who was now 17, shook Micah's hand with tremendous seriousness. Micah's younger brother Eli had come up from Texas for the wedding, and he was tall and good-looking, and had something of his brother's steadiness without quite the same gravity, and he pulled Annie aside at one point and said, "He's been happy this year in a way I didn't think he knew how to be, and that's your doing, and I want you to know I'm grateful." "It's mutual," Annie said. "I promise you." They moved into Micah's soddy that night because it was larger, having been built for the possibility of a future rather than just the present, and they began the business of combining two lives into one with the particular efficiency of people who have already been doing it in spirit for months. Her books found space on the shelf beside his. Her good knife went on the kitchen table next to his. Clover moved in with his gray horse, and they stood in adjoining stalls with the philosophical calm of two animals who had been neighborly for 10 months already and saw no reason to change. Spring came to the territory in March with a particular violence of green, as though the land was making up for the austerity of winter in a single explosive burst. The creek ran full and clear. The cottonwoods put out their first leaves. The red clay warmed in the sun, and the smell of it, that complicated mix of earth and possibility, came in through the open door of the soddy every morning when Annie opened it. They had 98 acres planted between the two claims, which was more than either of them could have managed alone, and was exactly the right amount for the two of them together. They had divided it with the careful logic of people who respected each other's judgment. Her corn and sorghum on the better drained northeast ground, his wheat and some barley on the slightly heavier southwest soil, a shared kitchen garden of impractical size, which had been her idea, and which he supported enthusiastically despite the impracticality. The work of the planting season was relentless, and they were in it together from before dawn until after dark for 3 weeks straight. They developed the rhythms of it, the way two people who are well-matched develop rhythms, not from negotiation but from a natural attunement to each other's pace and need. She was stronger than he had expected her to be, which he mentioned once. She said that she was only as strong as she needed to be, which was true of everyone. He said that not everyone made that kind of use of necessity, and she said that was a generous way to describe stubbornness. Darrell Croft appeared one more time that spring, in April, a year almost to the day after the land rush that had brought everyone here. He came on a Thursday morning when Annie was alone, Micah having gone to town for supplies. This time Croft had no lawyer and no muscle, just himself on a tired horse, and something had changed in the quality of him. He looked older than he had the previous year and less convinced of his own position. He stopped at the property line and took his hat off, which surprised her. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said. The use of her married name was deliberate, she thought, an acknowledgment of the new legal status of the land. "Mr. Croft," she said. She was holding a hoe and she did not put it down. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I came at you wrong last year. Came at you from a position of thinking you were temporary, that you wouldn't hold on, that the land would come available in time." He turned his hat in his hands. "You held on. Both of you held on. The thing I came to understand over the winter is that I went about the whole business wrongly, and I'm not proud of it. She looked at him for a long moment. He had the look of a man who had said the thing he came to say and was waiting to see what it cost him. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "The land is not for sale and that won't change, but I hold no lasting grudge toward a man who can recognize when he's been wrong." He nodded and put his hat back on and turned his horse toward town. She watched him go, and then went back to hoeing the garden bed, with a feeling of something tidily concluded. When Micah came back from town, she told him, and he listened and said, "How do you feel about it?" "Good, actually," she said. "Like the last piece of a loose thing coming into place." He put the supplies away and came to help with the garden, and they worked through the rest of the afternoon in the easy, companionable way they had developed, talking sometimes and silent other times, and the land stretched around them green and ready in the April sun. That summer was good. Not easy, nothing about farming in the territory was easy, but genuinely good in the way of a season that delivers on its promises. The corn came up strong. The wheat was excellent. They had enough not just for their own needs but to sell at the Guthrie market, which they did in August, standing at their wagon at the end of the market lane while a steady stream of buyers took the bushels and left money in exchange. "Do you remember the stagecoach?" Annie said, "on the way home with the wagon lighter and the coin box heavier." "I remember you telling me about it," Micah said. "I thought I was ready for hard things," she said. "I had prepared myself entirely for hardship. I had made a kind of peace with the idea that this would be a life of difficulty that I would endure through character." "And," he said, "and it has been difficult, absolutely," she said. "But the difficulty doesn't feel the way I expected it to. I expected it to feel like something I was getting through on my own. It feels instead like something we're doing together, and it turns out that changes everything." She paused. "You changed everything. The hard things are still hard, but they feel possible. You make the hard things feel possible." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You do the same for me, you know that." "I do know that," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on her knee and held it for the rest of the ride home. In the autumn of 1890, Annie told Micah she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening when the harvest was in and the pressure of the busy season had eased and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. She had been certain for 3 weeks, and she had spent those 3 weeks turning the knowledge over in her mind the way you turn a new stone, examining it from every angle. He sat very still for a moment when she told him. Then he said, "Annie." "I know," she said. "It's a great deal." "It's wonderful," he said, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before, a quality of pure, uncomplicated feeling, without reservation or complexity. "It is absolutely wonderful." She had thought she knew how she felt about it, but seeing his face she understood something she had not fully acknowledged to herself, which was that she was also delighted, deeply and simply delighted, in a way that surprised her. "I was not sure how you would feel," she said. "I am certain how I feel," he said. He stood up and came around the table and pulled her up and held her with both arms carefully, as though she were something he did not intend to let go of. "I have everything I wanted right here in this house, and now there is more of it. That is exactly how I feel." She pressed her face into his neck and let herself feel the whole of it without managing or measuring it. The lamp burned. The wind moved outside. The territory was dark and wide and full of consequence around them, and she was here, thoroughly and entirely here, with this man who had made the hard things feel possible since the morning she had arrived. The winter of 1890 into 1891 was the harshest the territory had seen since settlement, which the older hands said was saying something. It came in hard at the end of November with a series of blizzards that closed the road to Guthrie for 3 days and made daily chores a negotiation with a cold that had no interest in human discomfort. Micah reinforced the sod walls with additional chinking. He moved both horses into the enlarged barn and added a third stall for a milk cow he had acquired in October in anticipation of the baby's needs. He added another layer to the roof with extra sod and timber he had put by specifically for this purpose. Annie, who was 6 months along by December, made no concessions to her pregnancy beyond the ones that were physically necessary, which Micah observed with a mixture of admiration and careful concern. He did not tell her to slow down. He adjusted his own work to keep him close enough to be useful without hovering, which was a delicate balance he managed with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. She did slow down in January because her body required it, and she was too practical to argue with her body. She spent more time inside, which she managed by filling the time with sewing and reading, and the careful planning of the coming spring's planting, which she mapped on paper with the seed catalogs open around her like a spread of playing cards. She had decided to plant more sorghum this year and less corn based on the market prices from the summer. She had also decided to expand the kitchen garden to include proper herbs, which she had been wanting since her first summer and had not had time to establish. When she told Micah her plans, he listened carefully and asked good questions, and had two suggestions of his own, both of which she thought were excellent, and they revised the plan together at the kitchen table with the wind howling outside and the stove doing its level best against it. Helen Dawes came to stay in February, as the birth approached, because Helen had delivered 3 children of her own and had helped with half a dozen others, and was the most reliable midwife in the community. She was a warm, brisk woman who brought practical competence and an easy laugh, and whose presence in the house was immediately comfortable. Micah Rhodes, who was not a man given to visible anxiety, was in the first stages of visible anxiety by the time February ended. He was managing it well enough that Annie found it more touching than alarming, the way he would come in from the barn with a manufactured reason to be inside, the way he had taken to looking at her with a kind of focused attention that had nothing of his usual ease in it. "Micah," she said, one afternoon when Helen had stepped outside. "Yes," he said immediately. "This is natural," she said. "I am strong. Helen is competent. It is going to be all right." "I know," he said. "You're worried." "Of course I'm worried," he said. "You are the person I love most in this world, and there is nothing I can do for the next part of this except be here." She reached out and took his hand. "Being here is everything," she said. "Being here is what I need." Their son arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of March, in a hard February cold midnight that had the temperature down to single digits outside, while inside the soddy the stove was going full and the lamp was bright. He arrived loud and emphatic, and with a quantity of dark hair that surprised everyone, including Helen. Micah was in the room because Annie had wanted him there, and she was not someone whose wants were easily dismissed, and he was the one who held his son for the first minute of the boy's life, while Helen attended to Annie, and his face in that minute was something Annie saw from across the room and stored permanently. They named him James, after Annie's father. James was not a small baby or a quiet one. He was opinionated from the beginning, vocally and physically, and he grew with the same speed the territory grass grew in spring, visibly and without apology. By summer he was crawling with the determined efficiency of someone who has identified a destination and intends to reach it. Annie nursed him and worked and slept when she could and woke when he required it, and felt the peculiar simultaneous exhaustion and richness of early motherhood without sufficient sleep. Micah was present in the ways that counted. He took the night shifts without being asked when Annie needed sleep. He took James in the mornings when the baby was his most contentious so that Annie could have 2 hours of uninterrupted work. He carried James in a cloth wrap while he did chores that permitted it, and the sight of this man, this capable, unsentimental, deeply practical man, walking his fields with a baby bound to his chest and a look of complete contentment on his face, was something she thought she would spend the rest of her life grateful to have witnessed. The summer of 1891 was good again, though drier than the year before and requiring more attention to the irrigation channels Micah had dug along the corn rows. The market prices were steady. Their combined operation was developing a real reputation in the Guthrie market as reliable and of good quality, which translated to regular customers, who arrived early specifically for their corn and wheat. Eli came up from Texas again in July, this time for a longer visit, and he spent a month helping with the summer work and teaching James, who was 4 months old and entirely unimpressed by labor, to make sounds that might eventually become words. Eli announced at the end of his visit that he was considering making the move north permanently, that Texas felt too settled for his taste now, and that the territory had a quality to it that appealed to him. "There's good land east of here still available," Micah said. "I know it," Eli said. "I've been thinking." Eli did come back the following spring, 1892, and filed a claim on land to the east, not so close that it crowded anyone but close enough that visiting was easy, and the Rhodes family operation expanded by another quarter section of good farmland and one more pair of capable hands. By the fall of 1892, Guthrie had grown into a proper town, a territorial capital in fact, with real government buildings, and a population that had gone from nothing to several thousand in 3.5 years. The raw urgency of the early days had softened into something more permanent, a school that James would eventually attend, churches, a newspaper, a proper courthouse, stores that sold things at competitive prices because there was finally competition, a doctor who had set up a real practice and not just a tent with a supply box. Annie went to the newspaper once and spent an afternoon talking to the editor, a sharp-minded woman named Clara Whitmore, who had come from Missouri with her husband and had effectively taken over the editorial operation within 6 months. They talked about the territory's future and the rights of settlers and the ongoing complications of the land that had been promised and then unpromised and promised again. The complicated and painful business of what it meant to open land that had been someone else's first, which was a thing Annie thought about and did not have tidy feelings about. The displacement of the 5 civilized tribes from this land, the history of broken treaties and government compulsion, was real and present in the territory's daily life in ways she had not fully understood until she lived here. She talked to Micah about it. He had thought about it too, more than she had expected, and they talked honestly about the complexity of being beneficiaries of a system they had not designed and could not fully endorse, and what that meant and what obligations it created. "I don't have an easy answer," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "But I think the obligation is to see it clearly and to treat every person fairly regardless of which side of the land's history they come from." "That's a start," he said. In 1893, Annie found out she was expecting their second child, which arrived in November as a boy they named Thomas, called Tom from the beginning by everyone including James, who was by then an extremely active 2-year-old with strong opinions about everything in his proximity, and who received his brother with a mixture of scientific curiosity and competitive caution. Tom was the quieter of the two, observant and deliberate in the way his father was, with Annie's auburn hair and Micah's dark eyes, and the combination was something that made strangers stop and look twice. James was louder and quicker, more like Annie in temperament, with a directness that could be breathtaking in a 2-year-old. The house had to be expanded. This was a practical conclusion that they reached together on a winter evening with both boys asleep and the plans spread out on the table. The soddy had served them beautifully, but it was not large enough for 2 adults and 2 growing boys and the accumulated material of a successful 4-year operation, and the territory had prosperous enough now that there was good lumber available in Guthrie at reasonable prices. "What are you thinking?" Micah asked, looking at her rather than the plans. "I'm thinking 4 rooms," she said. "Proper wood frame, big kitchen, window on the south side of every room, a front porch because I have wanted a front porch since the day I arrived." "You'll have your porch," he said. "I know I will," she said, smiling at him. "We're building it." They broke ground on the house in the spring of 1894 with Eli's help and that of Frank Dawes and 2 men from town who were good with timber framing. It went up over 3 weeks of intensive work, and watching the real walls rise out of the red clay earth, watching the actual windows go in with their actual glass that caught the actual light. Annie felt a surge of emotion so complete it was hard to stand in. She was standing on what would be the front porch, looking south toward the creek, when Micah came to stand beside her. James was somewhere in the field with Eli, his voice carrying high and clear across the distance. Tom was in the basket she had hung from a timber, sleeping with the philosophical calm of a 6-month-old who had not yet discovered there was anything to worry about. "What are you thinking?" Micah asked her, the same question he always asked, because he was genuinely interested in the answer. "I'm thinking about the stagecoach," she said. "About that first day. I was so ready for everything to be hard. I had made it a point of pride that I could take the hardness of it." She paused. "I didn't know what I was walking into was this." "What is this?" he asked, though she thought he knew. "Everything," she said. "A real life, the life I couldn't have imagined because I had never seen it." She turned to look at him. "You, specifically you made it, all of it, feel not just endurable but actually good. I came here expecting to survive and I ended up happy. I came expecting hardship and I found you and you made the hard things feel possible." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood on their unfinished porch in the late afternoon sun of the territory and looked out over their land, their crops, their creek, their life. "I didn't know either," he said quietly. "What was possible? I thought I was coming here to have something of my own. I didn't know the something would be this good." The house was finished by June, white-painted wood frame with 4 proper rooms and a kitchen with a good iron range and a front porch that faced south across the fields toward the creek. Annie put a rocker on the porch and planted the climbing rosebush, which had survived the move from behind the old soddy, against the south wall of the house, and within a year it had made its ambitions about the porch railing perfectly clear. James started school in the fall of 1895, at 4 years old, in the Guthrie schoolhouse that now had 2 rooms and 2 teachers. He went with tremendous enthusiasm on the first day, and came home with equally tremendous opinions about everything he had learned, which he delivered at the supper table with the authoritative energy of someone who had been waiting for information to disseminate. Tom, at nearly 2, watched his brother with focused admiration and did his best to replicate everything James did, which led to several domestic incidents of moderate consequence and a general policy of keeping the good china out of reach. Micah watched his sons at the supper table one evening in the fall of 1895, the light falling warm and golden across their faces, James explaining something about a river he had learned about in school with his hands demonstrating the current, Tom nodding along with the seriousness of a younger brother who has decided agreement is the safest policy, and his expression was the expression Annie had first seen at their wedding and had seen regularly since, pure, uncomplicated contentment. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that still, after 6 years of daily proximity, had the quality of making her feel fully seen. Eli had prospered on his own claim to the East. He had married in 1894, a woman named Ruth who was a schoolteacher and had firm opinions about literature and soil management, and was in Annie's estimation exactly what Eli needed. They had a daughter in 1895 and were expecting their second child, and Sunday dinners had become a regular institution, the 2 families gathering at one house or the other for the midday meal and the particular comfortable noise of people who are genuinely glad to be together. In the late summer of 1896, Annie went to the Guthrie newspaper and talked to Clara Whitmore again, this time with a specific proposition. She had been writing, not formally, but in the notebooks she had kept since Ohio, observations about farming, about the territory, about the practical management of a homestead, about the questions she had answered through trial and error that she thought other settlers, especially women settlers, needed answered before the trial began. Clara read what she had written and said yes immediately. Annie began writing a regular column for the Territory Gazette, appearing every other Wednesday under her own name. She wrote about farming practices and food preservation, and the management of livestock, and the particular challenges and rewards of the territory's climate. She wrote practically and honestly, and without condescension, and the readership response was, by the standards of a frontier newspaper, remarkable. Letters came in. People stopped her in Guthrie to tell her that such and such piece had saved their crop or clarified their confusion about a particular problem. She told Micah about the letters one evening, and he said, without any surprise in his voice, "Of course they write. You write the truth about how to do things, and people who are trying to do things need that." "It feels strange," she said, "being read by strangers. It felt strange to leave Ohio," he said, "and then it felt right." She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "it did." In 1897, their daughter was born, in the spring, in the house with the good windows and the front porch. They named her Margaret, after Micah's mother. She arrived in the early morning, which seemed characteristic to Annie, who had suspected throughout the pregnancy that this child would be her own person in the most thoroughgoing way. Margaret proved this theory immediately by being, from the first hours of her life, serene in a way her brothers had never been, observing the world around her with a focused quiet that reminded Annie of Micah at his most concentrated. James, at 6, was magnificent with his sister. He took the responsibility of older brother with a seriousness that was both genuine and slightly comic, informing Tom on the day Margaret came home that they were in charge of making sure she was safe, which Tom accepted with the gravity it deserved. For several weeks, both boys could be found stationed near the baby's basket with proprietary attention, ready to report to their parents any development they thought required adult review. The territory was changing. Oklahoma was pushing toward statehood, a political process that was complicated and contentious, and which occupied the Guthrie newspaper and the community conversations with increasing intensity as the years moved through the late 1890s. Annie followed it closely and had opinions that she expressed in print and in person with the directness that had always characterized her. Micah followed it with the same attention and less volume, which was their usual distribution of public and private engagement. The farm had evolved by 1898 into something genuinely productive and well-regarded. They had 200 acres under cultivation between the two original claims, which were legally combined now under their joint name, and a third parcel they had purchased east of their original ground in 1896 when it came available. They had a team of good draft horses, a herd of 12 cattle, a proper dairy operation that supplied cream to 3 households in town, and the kitchen garden that had long since abandoned any pretense of being merely practical and had become a genuine enterprise in its own right. Annie's column in the Gazette had been running for 2 years and had been picked up, she learned with some disbelief, by 2 other territory newspapers. Clara Whitmore told her this with considerable satisfaction, as though she had personally arranged it, which she had. One September evening in 1898, Annie sat on the front porch in the rocker she had wanted since her first day in the territory. The rosebush had achieved its ambitions about the railing and then some, climbing to the roof edge, and producing, in its seasons, a quantity of flowers that made the south side of the house smell like something out of a garden magazine from a city that had nothing to do with red clay and hard summers. James was inside doing his school reading. Tom was helping Micah with the evening barn chores, following his father around with a focused attention to every task that was so familiar it made Annie's chest ache with affection. Margaret, who was 18 months old and had strong views about the outside world's right to exclude her from it, was on the porch with Annie, sitting between the rocker's legs and examining a pine cone with total concentration. The sun was going down behind the western edge of the property, laying gold across the fields, across the corn that was in its last weeks, across the flat, beautiful, complicated land that had been waiting for her without knowing it on the day she had stepped off a stagecoach and let the territory's smell hit her and known, with a certainty that lived below reason, that she was going to make it here. She had not known about Micah, specifically. She had not known about James and Tom and Margaret, about the house with its windows and its porch, and its walls full of the accumulated evidence of a real life. She had not known about Eli and Ruth on the neighboring claim, about Helen Dawes, who was her closest friend, about Clara Whitmore and the newspaper column, about the particular pride of selling your own crop in a market where people knew your name because of the quality of what you brought them. She had known she was capable of hard things. She had come expecting nothing but the hard things. What she had found was all of it, the hardness and the beauty of it, and the man who stood in the center of all of it, steady and warm and real, who had looked at her on her very first morning in this place, and seen not a woman out of her depth but a neighbor with her bearings, and had treated her accordingly from that first moment and every one since. Micah came around the corner of the house with Tom at his heels and Tom's small hand inside his large one, and he saw her on the porch, and his face did what it always did, settled into something easy and bright, and he came up the porch steps and kissed the top of Margaret's head and stood behind the rocker and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into the warmth of him. "Good evening," he asked. "Perfect," she said. Tom climbed up onto the porch railing with the confidence of a 4-year-old who has not yet fully internalized the concept of falling, and Micah moved a hand to steady him without breaking the conversation, which was so familiar, so purely and completely them, that Annie felt the whole of the years in it, the first morning and the cornbread and the fence in the rain and the land office and the wood hauling and the wedding, and all the ordinary extraordinary days since. "I was thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking that I came here expecting to survive," she said, "and I wanted to say it out loud again because it bears saying. I am not surviving, I am living. Every hard thing is better than I thought it could be, and you are the reason." His hands on her shoulders tightened slightly. "You were already going to make something of this," he said. "I just got to be part of it." "No," she said, turning her head to look up at him. "We made something of this, together. That's the only way it happened." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that had been looking at her honestly since the first day, and then he bent and kissed her temple and said, quietly against her hair, "Every day, every single one." Tom swayed on the railing and Micah caught him. Margaret dropped her pine cone and regarded this injustice with building outrage. James appeared at the door and announced that he had finished his reading and needed to know about supper. The sunset was painting the sky in colors that had no business being real. Annie stood up from the rocker and picked up Margaret, who pressed her face against her mother's neck, and she looked out at her land, her crops, her creek, her life, and she felt it complete and full and entirely, properly hers. The rosebush climbed the railing. The horses stood in the evening-cooled barn. The territory stretched in every direction with its old, indifferent confidence, still vast and still beautiful and still full of consequence, and she was here in the middle of it, thoroughly and deliberately here, with her family around her and her hands knowing the work and her heart knowing its home. She had come expecting hardship. She had found a man who made the hard things feel possible. She had found, in the end, everything.